Good morning. Good morning. Let's rock and roll. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Recording in progress.
And I'm very sorry about the delay here. We are actually still waiting for Frank Kelly. Frank, one of our speakers, was actually coming back from the West Coast and got off a plane and is heading home. And I think there may have been a glitch, but no worries, because we actually have a group of great speakers here, and I would not be surprised to see Frank joining in shortly. My name is Thomas Nguyen, and I am the Chief Global Markets Officer for SSI Securities Corp. We are the leading securities firm here in Vietnam. Today's discussion is really a continuation of our Gateway to Vietnam series, and today's discussion will be focused on the post-U.S. election impact and implications to Vietnam. I first do want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who are dialing in. We are expecting over 1,000 people dialing in from around the world. Certainly tons from Vietnam, but we are also having guests joining us from the region, from Southeast Asia, from China, from US, and from Europe. Vietnam is becoming quite a global story, and frankly, there's nothing much more global than the U.S. election and the results and the impact globally in terms of policy and regulation. Today, as you can see from the screen, I'm very excited. Our group of panelists, again, I would call this the dream team. They are not only a very handsome group of men, but they are extremely experienced and extremely expert on the subject matter. Normally, we would lead with Frank in terms of policy, but we're going to fast forward it to Ryan Caldwell, who is joining us from the FS Group. It's a $80 billion US asset manager in the US. Ryan is actually dialing in from Florida, and I was going to tease Ryan and say that Florida is Trump country, but frankly, after all that we've seen from the election, it seems like the whole of US is Trump country. So with that, Ryan, let me start with you. And let me just open up the discussion with really what's on my mind, okay? Is, Ryan, what the heck happened? I mean, we all thought that this was a close race. We all thought, sitting here in Vietnam and probably everywhere around the world, that it was too close to call. And then this happened. So can you please, first of all, explain to our audience from around the world what really happened? And then, of course, we will focus on looking forward and how it impacts investments.
Yeah, Tom, well, good morning. And again, I appreciate the audience, and this should be a lot of fun. And, as you mentioned, I am in Florida, which is sort of ground zero all of a sudden of what is now the Trump movement, I think, as it's spreading across the country. Look, Tom, I think it's a really good question as to what happened. I think the markets in the US sort of had this figured out a while ago. I would say, as early as a month ago. The US pollsters did not. And I think, Tom, the reason for that is, I think, a few fold. I think first, look, when you sort of deconstruct what the issues were in the election, right? I mean, many of these things were pretty well advertised. The state of the economy, which is an interesting point because the US economy has actually been pretty good for the last few years. Again, GDP growth has been quite good. Unemployment's been very low. But there is no question that there is a hangover from inflation that has infected all sorts of different parts of the US economy. And the average, and I'm going to say this maybe a few times in my introduction, the average American did not feel like the economy was working for them. So again, if you happen to have a lot of assets and you've benefited from stock market wealth, that's one thing. But the average American did not feel sort of the economic environment that they were living in, largely because the price level had moved so much from early in the COVID days. So again, the baseline of inflation was up so much. I think, look, the second issue, I think that was, underestimated by the pollsters, but the market understood very well. Again, it was just how upset the country was over the immigration policies of the Biden-Harris campaign. And again, this is something that, again, in a lot of different states and cities around the United States had percolated through a lot of different communities. And I think, when you look at sort of the exit results of the election, what's quite clear is that President-elect Trump won many demographic groups that a Republican candidate hasn't won in maybe forever, but almost back 40, 50 years. So whether it was Hispanic men, African-American men, suburban women, this was a wipeout in terms of the demographic that turned out to vote for President-elect Trump. So this really is what we would call, Tom, in the US, a mandate election. And so again, why did this happen? I think one of the other sort of curious things that happened in this election was that the Republican get out the first-time voter was much bigger than the pollsters saw. So what I mean by that is, again, in the United States, men typically don't vote. And there was a lot of first-time registered men that showed up and voted. And again, that was cross demographics. And again, in all the battleground states, an easy example would be a state like Pennsylvania that was supposed to be a very close race and a toss-up, and went to President-elect Trump on the back of what was very rural Amish farmers that showed up to vote for the first time. So again, the Republican Party did a very good job of just getting people that hadn't traditionally voted out to vote. And again, President-elect Trump's, message resonated with that voter. So like I said, Tom, I think what was a big surprise to the pollsters was not so much of a surprise to markets in the US. And maybe the thing I think markets are most surprised about is just maybe the depth of the victory. Again, President-elect Trump looks like he's going to come in. He will get the Senate. That's already been established. The Republicans will have a Senate majority. And again, it looks like, well, the House is still being counted, the House of Representatives. It still looks like the Republicans will retain control of the House. So, Tom, again, even relative to his election and victory in 2016, he's coming in with sort of his party in control as a one-term president with a mandate. And quite honestly, Tom, that's just not something we've seen in my lifetime or your lifetime, a president that's a one-term president with a very strong mandate to initiate change in his policy. So some of this reaction is just that, right? This is just a situation we just haven't seen before.
So Ryan, that's a good point, and I do hear market participants here even in Vietnam talking about this sweep. In terms of you have a Republican president, you have a Republican Senate, you have a Republican House. What does that really mean? I mean, to simply put it, is that good or bad, or is that not even the right question?
Well, look, I mean, Tom, it's a really good question because traditionally what Wall Street has liked and markets have liked is gridlock, right? And that means that like one party controls at least one portion of the government, and you don't have that. And so what I would say is if President-elect Trump can govern, then again, his agenda, if initiated, like the market is seeing that as quite positive. Traditionally, though, what has happened to a president that has both the House and the Senate is that it becomes very hard to govern, right? So actually, when you have the opposition party, at least in one of the chambers, you have somebody to kind of negotiate policy off of. And when you control all three chambers, the expectation from the voters is that you're going to get everything done. Right. So what I would say is now the burden that President-elect Trump now takes into this administration is that all the campaign promises voters will put a very high tax on, that he will get these things accomplished. And again, generally speaking in history, we've seen that's not as easy as you might think, even if you control all three chambers, because infighting in the parties can tend to happen. But again, today, Tom, for this discussion, President Trump would tell you he'd rather have all three chambers than have to be fighting the Democrats like he did in his first term. So for today, I would say that's probably positive for him, given how controversial his first 4 years were. And again, what he's looking to get done in maybe the second 4 years, he's thinking having this alignment will make things go much smoother. So again, controlling the Senate will mean his cabinet members get put up very quickly. Controlling the House means that legislative agendas should get followed very quickly. So again, what you should expect in the first 100 days next year after the inauguration is that a lot of things that President Trump promised on the campaign trail happen very quickly. So that's going to be the barometer to watch as we get into next year, is can he fulfill these promises that he's made? Because the American people have given him both chambers of Congress and a strong mandate to go initiate that agenda.
So Ryan, for our listeners here, many of them don't know you as well as I do. Ryan is a 25-year veteran in terms of as a global investor, asset allocation, deeply experienced in investing in any asset classes anywhere in the world. You and I have traveled the world together and have seen a lot together, Ryan. In absence of Frank, could you just outline what you think are the key policies that Trump represents, number one, and then take it forward and tell us from you're running a portfolio now, how are you thinking about it? And how does it really change the way you view your investments and how you view the world in terms of priority? So I apologize for leaning so much on this on you, but I think you can handle it. Yeah.
No, look, Tom, I think when you think about policies, and there's a few here, right? Maybe the very high level takeaway is that sort of the move toward deglobalization that started in the second half of the first Trump presidency is likely to accelerate faster. And what I mean by that is this decoupling, if you will, of the US from some of these global arrangements that have sort of set the world order for the last 20 plus years are likely going to be sort of under reevaluation. And so when I kind of think about policies and some of these policies, and we can see this already in the cabinet that President-elect Trump has already announced. Again, we're hearing, Mike Walls is likely to take over as head of the NSA. We're hearing Senator Marco Rubio, another Floridian, is likely to be Secretary of State. Tom, our good friend Scott Bessent, who we both know quite well, is very likely to be the Secretary of Treasury. All of these individuals have a very similar alignment. And I would say sort of the big first overarching takeaway is, as the US has sort of been spread in a couple of different places, Europe, Middle East, with maybe less of an eye on Asia, this administration globally is going to have a hard pivot toward China, right? And again, confronting China. And again, I think that's important given the area that you're in and the area of the world that you're in, because again, when we think about sort of outbound investment in this realignment, I believe current Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen said, we were in a regime of friendshoring, and I believe that that's exactly where we're likely to stay yet accelerate, which is the US is going to be very selective in the partners globally that it partners with. So you're going to have to be aligned with the US, not just economically, but also strategically and militarily in order to do business risk-free in the US again. So again, this tariff regime that we saw at the second part of President Trump's first term is likely to come back with a vengeance. Again, Robert Lighthizer, who led the sort of tariffing negotiations in the first administration, he is likely back in charge of commerce. Again, Senator Rubio, if he does end up as Secretary of State, has absolutely been a China hawk in his sort of rhetoric relative to, what are the bigger global threats. Again, Vice President J.D. Vance has mentioned China as a much larger threat than Russia. So again, I think the first thing in policy that's important is sort of the kind of Ukraine, European sort of NATO policy is likely to pivot to Asia. And again, we do expect a much more confrontational administration with China, and again, sort of China's allies than what's gone on before. Again, even though Biden-Harris had sort of elongated some of the Trump policies, again, the way that this administration looks like it's lining up is a much more pro-hawkish China. So Tom, from an investment perspective, what I would say is, look, when we look at global markets, and we've been saying this for the last 3 or 4 years, this decoupling and rebuilding of global supply chains, and again, you understand this sitting in Vietnam, what's happened to the Vietnam boom and the supply chain to the US, this is likely to continue and accelerate, right? What the US is going to want to try to force is less manufacturing in China and more manufacturing clearly on its own shores. When you think about nearshoring, and again, President Trump talking about tax cuts for US manufacturing, but even manufacturing done outside the US being done in places that are strategic allies to the US and not adversarial to the US. So again, the world really will continue to pull itself apart. And again, regionalization is likely to kind of come to the forefront, and supply chains are likely to look different than they've looked. And again, Tom, this has all been accelerating in the last 4 to 5 years anyway. We think more of that continues. When we flip back to the US and we say, what about US policy? Well, first and foremost, I think you have to start with immigration, right? One of the things that's been, sort of discussed hot and heavy in the last 48 hours with the appointment of President-elect Trump's border czar is that, again, we are going to see this border closed. We are likely also going to see deportation of illegal immigrants out of the US, right? That is, and again, that is sort of the mandate the president has been given. And again, one of the things that's been a benefit of illegal immigration into the United States is it's helped to keep wages down and bring inflation down from these very, very high peaks that we saw a few years ago. So talk to that earlier point I said about President Trump, again, some of these policies are going to be harder to implement than the campaign trail might sort of indicate. Their way of offsetting sort of this kind of wage inflation that's likely to come back if you bring jobs back to the US or export people, Tom, is to really, really export more energy, right? So second policy point I would bring out in the US is, again, President Trump has been on the forefront of saying, we are going to drill and we are going to export energy, because the exportation of energy, if we consume it ourselves and we export it to the world, right, we can use that to help offset some of the deficits that have been created. And again, that puts the US in a much stronger strategic position vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis the Middle East, if we're a net oil exporter. So again, we would expect, again, a lot more activity on sort of onshore drilling, offshore drilling. Again, one of the things that the Trump administration talked about in the first round, and again is indicated again, is things like liquefied natural gas, that the Biden-Harris administration had sort of curtailed the exportation of liquefied natural gas out of the US. All of those restrictions are likely to be lifted under a Trump administration. So Tom, that would be another policy point I would make, is that again, President-elect Trump has said, we want the US to be an energy exporter and to be a dominant energy player in the world. And then maybe, Tom, the last point I'll raise from a policy perspective, because again, I think it's likely to be very poignant in Vietnam, as you know, is that again, President Trump, one of the other things that was unique in this election was his courting of Silicon Valley, and particularly the crypto industry directly, right? And President Trump has sort of taken on as a mandate, and again, as has Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, again, who has a Silicon Valley background, to bring crypto mining to the US, right? And to create a sort of hub, if you will, of crypto mining. And again, one of the things that's performed quite well since President-elect's victory on Tuesday night, again, Bitcoin has been fantastic. The other cryptocurrencies have been fantastic, but the crypto miners have been spectacular stocks in the last 3 or 4 trading sessions in the US, because the belief is that we're going to do a lot more crypto mining in the United States than what had gone on prior. And again, that is again part of the campaign promise, if you will. Again, President Trump raised a lot of money out of Silicon Valley. There's been a lot of discussion about the 150 million that was raised from Elon
Hey,
Musk, but
Brian,
very big
Brian,
companies like Andreessen Horowitz
Brian.
also were contributors.
I'm so sorry for
Yes,
interrupting
Tom.
you. I know that Frank is trying to dial in, so whoever's running this, can you make sure that we allowed it for Frank to hop in? He was stuck on the tarmac apparently. So Ryan, apologize
I
for
can see you,
for the
Tom. Can you see
interruption.
me?
Oh, I can see you now. Okay, thank you. So you can hold on. We're Ryan is in discussion. We'll come back to you. Okay, Frank.
Take your time.
Okay. Yeah. So Ryan, on this point, I don't know if you're aware, but Vietnam is, I think, third largest trader of cryptocurrency. And so, obviously, again, sitting here in Vietnam, and I'm assuming those who are involved are have a very close watch on what's happening to crypto, hitting 89, I think, 89,000. Is that right today? So how sustainable is this? How real is this? Is this hype, or do you think there is a real fundamental driver to get crypto heading in the direction that we're seeing
No,
right
look,
now?
Tom, I believe that this is going to be a stalwart of President-elect Trump's administration. So again, one of my very good friends happens to run the largest venture capital firm in the world, Ben Horowitz and Andreessen Horowitz. And I recently met with Ben. And one of the things he discussed was, look, the explosion, if you will, in the combination of both artificial intelligence meeting crypto. And again, all of the different businesses that are likely to be disrupted as the blockchain proliferates globally. And again, so look, Tom, I do think this is a place that's going to see significant capex, as well as the fact that, again, back to our point about, and again, we'll have to see if this is indeed the case. But again, if Secretary of Treasury ends up with Scott Bessent, Scott is very much a pro-crypto advocate, right? And there's been discussions among the Bessent, JD Vance camps around using cryptocurrency, reserve currency, if you proliferate more crypto mining in the United States. So no, Tom, I do believe this is likely to be a hallmark of the administration. Again, given that Elon Musk has the presidency here, given that Silicon Valley has the presidency here, and again, Tom, back to the point about election promises, right, and having to fulfill them, this was a big one that was made by the Trump campaign to the crypto community. So I do believe that, again, there's going to be expectations that that bill gets paid.
Okay, Ryan. Hey, I'm gonna let your voice rest a little bit now that we have Frank. I'm gonna come back to you for more investment-oriented questions. Okay, so thanks for pitching in. Frank was missing in action. Frank, you're turning my hair gray, man. Thanks for coming in here and in all seriousness, thank you for making this meeting. I know that you've been traveling all over the world. You're probably the busiest man in America. So Ryan did touch upon some policy stuff, but since you're the expert here, since you're in DC, and I do know that you've been actively talking to some of the biggest funds in the world about what's happened and what's going on and what to think about. Could you give us a decent summary, knowing that some of the things that you're talking about might have been touched upon by Ryan a bit? Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was on for a while and I was listening, Ryan. It was great. I loved what he was saying. Great commentary, and particularly around the crypto space. And it is interesting to see how the president is now beginning to fill out the cabinet, right? And Elise Stefanik going to the United Nations, and now seeing Marco Rubio being named Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, a former Green Beret, as National Security Advisor. I have to say, though, I'm surprised at the Rubio pick, and I'm surprised at the Waltz pick. This is not what a lot of people were thinking. These are people who are very experienced, very seasoned. They're not, I wouldn't say they are doctrinaire. And so it's very interesting. And I knew Elise Stefanik when she worked in the George W. Bush administration there in the White House in the Domestic Policy Council. So these are people that are not sort of the revolutionary type, if I can say that we saw in the first Trump administration. And in fact, recall in 2016, there was quite the adversarial relationship between Rubio and Trump, which is very interesting here. There seems to be a New York, Florida nexus. Rubio from Florida, Elise Stefanik from New York, Waltz is from Florida, and he also named the head of our environment. If you want a job in the Trump administration, it's probably good that you either live in one of those two states. It seems to where that seems to be going. I'll say this on the trade side, and maybe I'll differ with Ryan here a little bit. My view is you have to take a man at his word, and with Trump and on tariffs, and particularly the target of China, and that seems to be the common easy thing to target is China and the United States, either for real reasons or not. I'm not, we get pretty deep on this. I mean, there's, I think, close to 200 pieces of legislation in the U.S. Congress that have been introduced by various members that is perceived as anti-China. Now, I would also point out most of them haven't moved. They're just sitting there, and they're going to die at this end of this Congress, because a new Congress comes in, and then you have to reintroduce all that legislation. You got to hold hearings again. You got to do all that, right? And it almost is as if many members of Congress introduce these things to be seen as tough on China, but really don't put a lot of effort into actually moving them, which is a political statement. So with my experience with the former president, soon to be president, and Tom, you and I, we dealt with him in our previous lives, and when we worked together, he was our client. I'll say this about him. I think people need to understand that this is a very commercial person. I know that sounds obvious, but he's not a politician per se. It's all about the deal, right? So what is already going through talking to his campaign people on the national security side, he seems to have this vision that he hasn't articulated yet, that there's a grand bargain, and that's the phrase they're using, that can be developed and structured with China. And quite frankly, I can see it, right? Not just in terms of a bilateral relationship, in terms of you do this for us and we can work out on the trade side. But it's an interesting aspect that Trump clearly respects China as a global power. And maybe even more so than the Biden folks did. The grand bargain could include, I'm going to get into the foreign policy piece of this a bit. Trump, on election day, if you're looking for one capital in the world that it was the worst day ever, it was Tehran, Iran, right? Within 72 hours of the president being declared president, now he's going to be president again, the U.S. Justice Department arrested a number of Iranian assassins who were coming here to assassinate President Trump. He has a long, ugly, nasty relationship with the Iranians. So let me get this straight. I just got elected president, and you guys sent a bunch of guys over here to assassinate me. I'm not going to let that one go. And let's not forget what I did to your Revolutionary Guard Corps General Soleimani. I blew him into a billion pieces, and nobody expected me to do that, right? And that totally transformed from the Iranian perspective. Who is Iran's largest trading partner? It's China. Where does China get a lot of its oil from? It's Iran. Hey, China, you can just hear Trump talking like this. We can work something out. You help me with these characters over here. We can work something out. Let's cut a deal, right? So I do think on the China piece of trade, it's going to be nuanced because Trump understands there's multiple things to be done here. And by the way, let's figure out what to do with North Korea, right? All of the reports here are, and in talking to Defense Department officials and others, China is not happy with North Korea sending 10,000 troops into Ukraine. And they're not particularly happy with this relationship that is budded with Russia, where they're selling huge amounts of weaponry to the Russians. Okay, maybe we've got some commonality here. Maybe you can help us get the Russians to start scaling back and moving towards a peace agreement with Ukraine. So I take a perhaps too nuanced too sanguine, but I do think that Trump, he very much respects President Xi, and I think that he wants to see if he can cut a deal, and he understands the power and the potency of China, both commercially on the international stage, but also militarily, and that this is something we need to work with this, right? So I think that's something to watch here. I do think it's interesting to see with his national security folks, including someone like Rubio, he's going to be looking not just at China, but in Latin America, which will be very important. And I see the president of Vietnam, I believe, is in Chile or headed down there, right? And the bilateral trade between Vietnam and Latin American countries. We have the APEC summit being held this week in Peru, right? President Xi is there. President Vietnam is there. President Biden is there. There's a lot in play here. And I think Rubio, being a Cuban American by birth, will have not solely, but there will be more of a Latin America focus. And we have to do that. And it has been utterly ignored for the last 4 years, which is bewildering to me because President Biden used to be so focused on Latin America when he was vice president under Biden, and then he just ignored it. Why do we have to do this? For critical minerals, right? We need the copper, we need the lithium, the mining capability that is down there. So I think that's going to be interesting. And again, who's already there? It's China, right? We have to deal with these countries, but if you're dealing with these countries, you're going to find the Chinese sitting at the table anyhow. Again, Trump looks at this not as a grand geopolitical strategy, it's a commercial strategy. So let's see how that plays out. I've also, yeah, go ahead.
If you don't mind me, I mean, this is a discussion, is that right? As I'm listening to you and Ryan, you know, one thing that I resist sitting here in Vietnam is consistently making a bullish story on Vietnam, regardless of the outcome. I mean, even though I believe this is the most amazing story and there are fundamental drivers of Vietnam, but the factors do matter to us. So on one hand, I'm hearing the consistent messages that U.S. will be very tough on China, sort of what Ryan is saying. And the conclusion for us sitting here in Vietnam is that's good for us because of the supply chain continuation of what's been happening.
Yes.
On the other hand, though, what I'm hearing from you, and it makes a lot of sense to me, because the one thing that's very predictable about Donald Trump is he's unpredictable from my perspective. And so would it surprise me that we look back, I don't know, years from now and say, wow, we thought he was going to be hard on China, but he actually hugged President Xi and they actually did a grand plan together. So I guess I'm just challenging myself, SSI, market participants to say, those scenarios, how does that impact Vietnam? Hypothetically, if you're right, Frank, that the whole China and US relation actually cools off, I guess, or if that's the right word, what does that mean to Vietnam, really?
I think no matter what happens between the US and China, even if it's a more favorable outcome, we're looking to diversify the supply chain. And from a geostrategic point of view, we want to build that relationship with Vietnam. I don't think that's going to go away. And one other thing, Tom,
Okay.
Looking back at my notes from the call we did before the election, if you recall, I pointed out that there were 53,000 Vietnamese, either actual emigres or the children of emigres from Vietnam, live in Pennsylvania. So I checked with my friends at the campaign. Do you have any sense of how those people voted?
I can guess. Yeah, I can guess.
Yes,
Yeah,
and you can guess who they overwhelmingly voted for, and you can guess that person who is about to become president of the United States again remembers that, right?
Okay.
So these things matter, and so I think it's the little things like that. If you want to call that a little thing, winning Pennsylvania was stunning. He had to win Pennsylvania to win, and he did. So I think those things, but the geopolitical, a balance of power, if you will, it is a balance of power throughout the region. It is going to be the supply chain, and what can we do to get the Vietnamese to invest in the U.S.? What can we do to invest there? I think that's just going to be on a growth trajectory. I don't see Donald Trump pushing that away. And recall, as an example of this, look at the relationship he developed in his first presidency with Prime Minister Modi of India. You would have thought that would have been adversarial, right? Because India is not the easiest place to invest in. Those two guys became the best of friends. And it was Trump in May of 2020, when he flew to India and encouraged Prime Minister Modi, put forward your investment package that would help lure manufacturing out of China to India, right? With all sorts of incentives. And Modi was worried about doing it. And it was Trump who flew over there. It was a very unusual thing he did. And he encouraged him to do it. And Modi was very grateful to him. So again, these are the things that people don't realize or think through with Trump. Last thing I'll say about trade. Look where President Biden, all due respect, thank you for your service, sir, but not a single free trade agreement during his presidency. If anything, he killed him. He killed a budding free trade agreement with the UK. Look at the Trump administration. I'm not being an advocate for or against. I'm an impartial analyst. Trump renegotiated free trade agreement with South Korea. He launched a free trade agreement with the UK. He renegotiated the NAFTA into the USMCA between Mexico and the United States. And he was looking at other free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements. That he did that in his 4 years, and Biden didn't do any. So I think that again, it's the unpredictability. And then people begin to predict, weirdly enough, he's anti-free trade. He doesn't want to do free trade agreements. And the facts are very different. So I think that you will see on the trade side, he is threatening everybody in terms of tariffs, but he doesn't immediately apply them. And he's a casino builder. He's a hotel builder. He is negotiating and used to negotiating with plumbers and bricklayers and tough people. And he goes in hard, and then he ends up cutting the deal.
Got it. Thank you, Frank. Before we pivot over to our own chief economist, I do want to ask Ryan a quick question. Ryan, Ryan, a big thing that we follow here sitting in Vietnam is, what happens to the dollar. Currency matters to us. So FX and rates. Can you just, before we pivot over to our chief economist, just give your perspective on the policy, his policy, and how you think that will play out within the rates and FX world?
Yeah, no, look, Tom, it's a really good question because, some of the public statements that, President-elect Trump has made, and, even, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance actually had a pretty poignant line about kind of currency strength, has not been a benefit to the U.S. outside of, getting it cheaper goods, right? I mean, he made a fairly eloquent point that the U.S. manufacturing base was hollowed out with a strong dollar. So we got cheap goods, but we lost a lot of domestic production. So I think, prior to the election, the market had the view that kind of a Trump win would be sort of a weak dollar presidency, but that's very quickly sort of faded as of the last, 4 or 5 days on the back of, well, look, if there are sort of better corporate tax breaks here, we are an energy producer here, right? The growth is likely to be better here than maybe other places. And one of the points I absolutely do agree with Frank is, look, when we kind of look around the map, and I would agree with him absolutely on Iran, the other place I might point out is Europe. I actually think Europe is likely to be a little bit at a disadvantage here relative to some other regions in the world. Again, in sort of a in a new Trump Vance regime, and so it does beg the question, outside of crypto and maybe gold, what would be your other currency, right? We continue to come back to this point about, right, what is the competing currency to the dollar as from a developed market standpoint, and there still doesn't seem to be a good one, right? Obviously, the Japanese yen has been quite weak. Again, the euro, they look like they'll have relatively subpar growth. Maybe they're going to have to foot more of the bill to defend themselves going forward, right? Again, we've seen some of that rhetoric already coming out of Germany last week about, conscriptions and the cost to kind of fund the tail end of Ukraine, right, in the Trump administration. So again, I would say, look, I think President Trump and Vance have said we'd like a weaker dollar because it helps U.S. production. I don't see an easy path to getting there. However, and again, even as recently as this weekend, there are more rumors out of Beijing about an RMB depreciation cycle again, right? Again, if there are sort of threats of tariffs that, again, China might devalue. And again, that sort of started to get whispered again over the weekend. That's all stronger dollar stuff. So again, I think, Tom, maybe to Frank's point, some of the rhetoric may just not line up with sort of some of the outcomes. And so again, like I said, I think, in a perfect world, we'd like a really weak dollar to make more stuff. I just can't foresee an easy world where we get there. Again, particularly, again, given China's economic situation, again, they might need to devalue, right, just to stay competitive given what's gone on in their own economy.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Okay, Hung, you're up, and as everyone should know, Hung Pham is our very own chief economist, one of the leading voices in Vietnam about macro issues and economic dynamics in Vietnam. He also has quite extensive experience with working within the government, so understands the regulatory and policy responses to global situations. So Hung, why don't you give us your perspective? There's a lot to digest here from Frank and Ryan. Would love your thoughts on how you look at the impact of what's happened in the U.S. into Vietnam.
So I think like in Vietnam, how can I say, we don't say like bad news, we say challenge. So I think first here, we know like Frank and Ryan talk about the globalization, and Vietnam is a trade dependent country. So of course, when the tariff man is in charge, I think we will have some kind of like a negative development here. But you already know that Vietnamese policy is more for the non-alignment. Thus, we don't choose sides. So it means like the country, they try to have the free trade agreement with almost everyone. I think it's nearly like 20 free trade agreement with the others. So that kind of non-alignment policy can help Vietnam to be like a connecting country in this fragmented world. And I think basically for that kind of post-election impact, I think in short term, we might not see anything, because even people will try to ramp up export and front load some of our export to the US, so we don't see too much development. But the problem for the Vietnamese government in the at the moment, and even like 10 years ago, it tried to close the trade deficit with the US. But basically, we don't we try a number of times to buy more things from the US. Previously, it can be like airplane and some of the agriculture products, but still the gap is still huge. I think the trade deficit with the trade surplus from Vietnam to the US in the first 10 months of the year is close to 90 billion US dollar. So maybe the trade balance is nothing we can do about it at the moment. I think more like Frank said, maybe we need to have some kind of like investment from the Vietnam to the US, or to like to have to mitigate the impact, because the country need to do something in the world of like stick and carrot. Maybe we are more preferable with the carrot. We sweeten the deal with the US by provide more investment into the US, because at the moment I think closing the gap is a little bit different. And by now Vietnam and US, we have the strategic partnership here, but we don't have any free trade agreement. And the only arrangement we have at the moment is Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I think the development is still quite limited at the moment. And we don't even have this market economy status under the Biden administration. So we do expect that maybe, like Thomas says, thing is unpredictable under the Trump one. So maybe we have some kind, maybe after we have such a high tariff, we can start with some kind of like free trade agreement discussion, or even like deeper integration into the supply chain with the US under the IPEF. I think is a good point. But overall, if I say like one thing about Vietnam, I think we learned about Trump administration like 8 years ago. So now the focus might be help Vietnam to accelerate our domestic growth driver, because at the moment we still like the two-speed recovery is more on the external driver that drive Vietnam growth at the moment. The domestic growth is quite sluggish at the moment. So maybe the one of the post-election impact from the US is we need to accelerate the domestic growth driver, like we try to spend more on public investment. And the good news is our fiscal position is very healthy at the moment, because you know that the public debt per GDP in Vietnam is less than 40%. I think 37% of the GDP, way lower than other countries. So it means you can spend it more a little bit from now on.
If I could ask Frank a question that you brought up, and Hung, Frank, I know I had some insight or some thoughts about Vietnam's status as market economy. You know, certainly we were turned down in the recent past. Any updates there or thoughts there given Trump's win?
Look, I think one of and this will be interesting to see how Trump handles this. I think large degree why we haven't seen more free trade agreements under Biden, as I mentioned a moment ago, and to the point now with, not that it was a free trade agreement with Vietnam, but it's certainly an elevation. I'm of the view, a lot of the stuff was Joe Biden protecting the unions in the United States, right? This is the unions didn't like the free trade agreements, so he didn't do them. And my prediction is that we're going to go back and we look at what happened under Biden with Vietnam. There may have been technical issues on the trade side, but again, this is a union thing, right? Joe Biden walked the picket line when they were in the United Auto Workers, first president of the United States to do it. I don't think that's where Donald Trump's going to be, right? And he's going to look for opportunities and deals. He loves cutting deals. I think it's going to be a very different approach and vision with Vietnam. Now, that being said, the one thing that I still am trying to get my arms around, despite everything that Biden did for the unions, declaring himself the most pro-union president in history, as soon as he dropped out, the unions dropped him, and they didn't go for Kamala Harris. And they went overwhelmingly for Trump. The auto workers in Michigan, the steel workers in Western Pennsylvania, which was fascinating. They overwhelmingly went for Trump, despite the union endorsing Harris and the Nippon Steel, US steel deal still hanging out there. And we're waiting to see. Biden said he'd kill the deal. Reality was he hasn't killed it yet, because he was waiting to make sure that the unions came out and voted for Harris, and they didn't. I wouldn't be surprised if that deal goes forward, but we got to watch that closely, and that will be very telling for where things are going. Now, Trump said he would oppose the deal and kill it, but if Biden lets it go, I don't think Trump will pull it back. So let's see how that plays out. Again, it's all about the deal. What do we get out of this? You mentioned earlier Europe, right? Europe drives Trump out of his mind. You guys are always complaining that we're going to pull out of NATO. And what are you doing to build it for military? Now, they've done some incremental things, but for Trump, it's all, what have you done? We can't sell our agriculture in there, automobiles. Come on, guys. This is a two-way street. That's how Trump thinks.
Quick question also. There is a lot of talk about Trump and President Xi acknowledging each other quietly, shall we say, and there's also some suggestion that President Trump might be reaching out to President Xi for a handshake. Are you hearing anything like that in DC?
I would be surprised if we don't see something within the next 3 to 5 days where there's a phone call.
Thank you, Frank. I guess that you might have some insights there. So back to Anh Hung. Anh Hung, so some commentary that you made is interesting. So of course, Vietnam, we do have new leadership. And any insight, Anh Hung, in terms of how they're viewing this, one, and number two, the commentary you made that Vietnam might begin to pivot, focusing on the local economy, the domestic economy, and driving growth there. And do you know, do you have a sense that our new leadership is focused on that?
The good news is at least we had the phone call, right? Our General Secretary already called the President-elect Trump this morning, I guess. So at least we see things are going on well on our side. And I think for the Vietnamese government, we already, basically the election now should be in 2026. But the current development in the next few years make us like we got an early election. That's why we have a number of new leadership at the moment. And it is right about their policy direction at the moment. I think first, we should have a slimmer government. And by that, I mean, they try, the direction here is Vietnam is quite a fragmented country. It means we got too many small provinces. So we try to merge them together to bigger province, lesser government. And with that, we can spend less on the current expenditure and have more money for public investment. And that's the first point. And the second one is they try to something maybe like digital transformation. And by that, not only they got something like the e-government, they got the database for all the citizens here. But I think what's better about the digital transformation at the moment is when they try to connect all the database within Vietnam, from citizen, from the property, even from the security like us. I mean, from the brokerage account, from financial account, banking account, everything connected to one. I think they start to have maybe an open mindset for the digital assets. And that's a good point for Vietnam at the moment, because you know that we already have the draft of the new laws called the laws of the digital industry sector. And they put the definition of the digital assets there. And within this year, next year, they need to officially have an opinion whether to legalize the digital assets in Vietnam. And I think there are very huge expectation in Vietnam that thing will go through, and maybe Vietnam will allowing the digital asset trading here. But I think it's a big bet, but still we see some the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And
Hung,
yes.
if I could share with the audience, SSI has been working intimately with our regulators and our leadership to help create the framework for digital assets in Vietnam. And certainly we also have initiated a subsidiary called SSI Digital to really be core in terms of those efforts. So we as an organization are working very closely with the leadership of Vietnam to help create and to create that framework and to make it a reality. So I'm sure you're aware of that, but I just want to share that with our audience. Okay, so let's shift. Now we are going to Tanwa Chippewa, who is a long time partner of SSIAM. Chanwa has over 10 years of experience investing in Vietnam and has an incredible track record of significant outperformance. I think just this year, the collaboration between KKP, who Chan was with, and SSIAM, the performance is up 28, almost 30%. There's a outperformance versus the index of about 15%, 1,500 basis points to be more specific. So let's take it home here. There's a lot to digest, Tanwa. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of uncertainties. I still remember in our last call, you were maybe the wisest man, where you said it didn't quite matter to you who won. You were still very constructive and bullish on Vietnam. Would love your update, and also maybe at the edge, how your view might have slightly changed, if any, as you look forward on your investments in Vietnam.
Okay, Thank you. So I think my view is still quite slightly positive on the Trump victory. So like you said last time, I mentioned that I'm optimistic about Vietnam no matter who wins. So after listening to both Ryan and Frank today, I'm a little bit more optimistic than before, right? So if you remember the first Trump term, the first year was 2017. That year was a great year for Vietnam. Actually, the index performed very well. The reason is that I think partly is because of the massive tax cut in the US that help all the conglomerate, and those companies that actually do business with the US conglomerate is benefiting a lot, including some of the Vietnam companies. The second is the tariff, the trade war. I would say that the trade war has been helping Vietnam for the past, almost 10 years, because we are seeing a lot of FDI coming from China. So if you observe the market during the election day, you will see that the industrial estate name is going up a lot. You see that the export, especially those products which might replace China, is going up a lot. I think that's because of the movement of the supply chain coming back into Vietnam again. Okay. So a lot of people are also talking about the universal tariff, whether Trump will come and look at Vietnam again and then charge a tariff to 10 to 20%. Okay, but as Frank said, I also believe that Trump is a deal maker. He made India great again as well, right? Because he encouraged Modi to actually try to move the manufacturing from China into India. I don't see why he cannot do that for Vietnam as well, right? Because Vietnam is also one of the good friends of the US. Okay, so I think I'm positive on those parts on the trade war and everything. The only thing that I have to look out for as an investor is the interest rate and the USD strength. I think because of all the policy, the tariff, the tax cut, and everything will cause the inflation to go up in the US. We are already seeing the bond yield, the long-term one is going up. So the expectation of the rate cut might not be as strong as before, and that would impact the FX and the ability of the Central Bank of Vietnam to reduce the interest rate more. So that's the only risk that I see from the Trump presidency. The rest, I think we have to wait and see, but I'm still remain very positive on Vietnam.
I have a quick question, and Ryan, I might ping you on this one. There is a narrative that Trump's policy will be inflationary, and then of course all the side impact of that in terms of rates and so on and so on. But factually, Ryan, and maybe my recollection is off, but factually, even after the tariffs that kicked in in his first time in office, CPI was still relatively low. Is that right? And there is my sense is that China, at least at that point, ate a lot of the tariffs, if you want to call it that. So is this inflationary narrative, Ryan, an exaggeration, or do you think there is some basis to that? Because then that feeds back into some of his Tanwa's concerns and dynamics.
Yeah, Tom, look, I think, maybe to Frank's point, it depends sort of how many tariffs get actually applied relative to, negotiating to possibly be applied. And then to your point, how do companies treat said tariffs, right? Because you're exactly right. In the first go around, most of those tariffs were eaten either in the company margins or by the country itself. They actually didn't make it to the consumer. And we would argue this time around, it would be very difficult for companies to pass pricing again, right? Given the inflationary pressures that have already happened, from COVID. And again, back to this point about the price levels already moved. So again, I think, the knee-jerk reaction of the market was to sell off the long end, right? Part of that was a little bit of a disciplinary shot, maybe at President Trump to say there is a big deficit, right? And again, now his argument is with tax cuts and faster growth and producing more energy, right, that all of a sudden that will help to, alleviate some of the deficit issues and some of the interest on the deficit and some of the inflationary issues around that. But again, Tom, I would also point back to the immigration issue, right? If you do actually end up exporting labor, right? Again, one of the dirty secrets that was sort of acknowledged was that illegal immigration did help bring wages down relatively quickly, right? So again, if you get into a wage problem, right, that could be inflationary. And again, I don't know that companies will have the same pricing power. So, I think, Tom, the other point in this is, China's obviously still in a very deflationary place, right? It's the second largest economy in the world, right? And again, they haven't quite gotten their arms yet around their own housing issues, local government issues. They're trying, but again, that economy is still pumping out a massive amount of deflation at the moment. So I'm a little bit skeptical that inflation's just going to run away from you again in the short run, right? That was a lot of monetary policy, a lot of fiscal policy in a very short period of time, with a lot of impetus to spend it. And so again, I think some of these knee-jerk movements are likely to be sort of smoothed out. And again, that is a point I would agree with Frank. Rhetoric, rubber needs to meet the road, right? There's going to be a lot of rhetoric, and then we need to see what policy rubber actually meets the road in terms of what tariffs are actually applied, what regions of the world are they actually enforced on, what goods are they enforced on. All really hard to know at the moment. And so I would say probably the market's knee jerk on that is a little bit too violent, just given that the US economy has sort of settled down into a less inflationary place. I would, however, watch the wage side if we do really end up sort of deporting cheap labor out of here, which is a possibility.
Got it. Thank you. Back to Tanwa. So Tanwa, given all that, as you look forward, give us some perspective on first the industries that you like, help guide our listeners on areas that you as a very successful investor are looking at in the future. And then probably also types of stocks that you like. Help our listeners think about certain types of stocks that they should be looking at.
I see. Okay, sure, Tom. So I think the stock that we still like, the sector, I think the technology sector is still it's going to be the best to position yourself in the company like FPT, because the technology service that Vietnam is providing, especially to the US, is high quality, and I don't think that's fall under the tariff that Trump may, as the technology move away from China, move away from Taiwan, it might come more and more into Vietnam. We just heard the news that they just got a $200+ million new contract abroad. So the growth is very high potential there. So of course, FPT is one of them. The second sector that I would be looking at is the industrial estate. Okay, I think the industrial estate sector in Vietnam is very undervalued. So as the more FDI from the country like China coming into Vietnam, I'll be looking at those sectors more and more. Okay, and within the country itself, I think Vietnam is on the recovery path, and I think next year going to be another great year for Vietnam. It has been already good in 2024. I think 25 will be even better. So you guys might look at the retail guys that have the consumer exposure like Mobile World, or you might look at the property names as well, as the country is coming out of the crisis in 2022. So those are the sector that I would be looking at. Of course, the banks that will actually capture all of these flows, the export, the FDI, the consumption growth. So those are the sector that I would be positioning ourselves in.
Great. Actually, a question that just came through, Frank, actually through one of our listeners. There seems to be commentary that Trump's organization is going to invest 1.5 billion into Vietnam for golf course and development. Are you hearing anything about this? And what does this mean? Will Trump be spending more time in Vietnam?
If you can get that golf course built in the next 2 years, Tom, I will bet you the biggest, fattest dinner the next time I see you that Donald Trump is there in person playing on that course. That is a statement unto itself that they $1.5 billion to build in Vietnam. I think that's just absolutely extraordinary. So, right, and that To Lam has actually talked to Trump Have you seen that? Did somebody mention that they actually had a conversation that happened? It's Reuters is reporting that within the last 2 hours.
Yeah, and Hung mentioned that there was a call, but he wasn't as specific as you're making, Frank.
They actually had a conversation. I mean, can you imagine every world leader is trying to get to Trump, and so Trump has to schedule these calls. It says something who he's taking these calls from at this point. It's very, I think, very telling. So I don't want to sound like a cheerleader, but I think this is all very positive for the upside for U.S. Vietnamese relations, both diplomatically, politically, and certainly economically.
Thank you. As I wrap things up, I do want to ask Ryan one last question. Ryan, you've had 25 years of investing globally, as I mentioned, around the world. Your current portfolio is run via you have quantitative models overlaying fundamentals. Would just love for you to leave our listeners with just a step back in terms of the world. Sort of what are your models telling you? What areas of the world seem to be reflecting? What areas of the world seems to be fading? You know, certainly if you can zero in on emerging markets, because as you probably know, Ryan, there's a lot of discussion about Vietnam being upgraded to the emerging markets. And with your experience, please give us some insight and what to think about as that happens. And I certainly want to leave the listeners with that broad of a perspective.
Yeah, Tom, look, I mean, I think, you know, if you take a step back and just, you know, sort of maybe reset the world a bit. I mean, you know, first, look, the US has been powered by these incredibly profitable, once-in-a-lifetime technology companies. Now many that are on the forefront of developing next generation artificial intelligence. And Tom, they're companies of size and scope and profitability that quite honestly we've just never seen. I mean, empirically, nothing like this has ever existed. Companies this large, this profitable, growing this fast. And that's been the underpinning of the US market now for a while, right? That's not a new story. That's sort of been, you know, all the way almost back to pre-COVID, but it's obviously accelerated. And again, with the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, it's maybe accelerated more. And so, you know, this may be, you know, a place where, you know, I disagree maybe with Vice President-elect Vance, where, you know, again, there are benefits of having a strong currency. You attract a lot of capital from around the world, and we've clearly done that in the United States, and that's reflected obviously in the dollar. You know, when you look outside the US, what we would say is like, what, you know, what regions are growing and fading? We would say, look, I would jump up and down and say, look, Europe is absolutely fading. Right, that region, you know, benefited from COVID stimulus, but it is now fading, right? And it's in a pretty, you know, clear deceleration back to trend. Japan would be another region I would point to as fading, right? That was an area that, you know, many people got excited about for, you know, about 12 to 15 months. And again, there's been some incredibly odd monetary policy out of Japan in the last maybe 6 to 8 months, and the currency's been quite weak. And they never really got sort of their production and export companies sort of back in the globalization boom that maybe many expected. So, you know, if you think about sort of IFA, Tom, and sort of, you know, non-US developed markets, those have been quite tough all of a sudden and have started to fade, which then brings you to emerging markets. And like what I would say, Tom, is look, most of the last 3 or 4 years have been dominated by a couple of regions. One, the region you're in, Southeast Asia and India. Those have really been the dominant emerging markets because China has been so poor, right? And so again, Latin America has had some periods of cyclical outperformance and cyclical underperformance. And again, you know, even from an election volatility perspective, and I totally agree with Frank, it was a really odd outcome in the US that Latin America was just ignored almost from the US for the last 4 years. It's crazy. Again, given this sort of resource realignment, right? What's been happening in Latin America, but he's right. That's absolutely true. And so like when we kind of map out emerging markets, again, what I would say is like, look, you know, in quantitatively, the regions that are, very, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, quite attractive. To your point, if Vietnam were to reach emerging market status, Tom, as you know, we've seen that, playbook before with other countries. And again, what tends to happen is the flood of capital is enormous, right? Because global investors have to figure out a way to benchmark to it, right? And so very quickly, whether the country's ready for it or not, you tend to attract a lot of capital very quickly. And again, Tom, as you know, having studied Vietnam and been there and spent a lot of time, you've been on that trajectory now for a while. So I don't know that it would be so surprising. And again, given sort of, what's proliferated with the US, in the relationship building with the US would be interesting.
Ryan, you might be kind of answering it, but let me be more pointed. How important is it that Vietnam gets upgraded?
Oh, it's critical.
And
It's critical, Tom. It's a massive deal. It's a massive deal in terms of index inclusion, capital allocation, right? Again, even sort of normalized trade relations. It's a very big deal. I mean, remember China, from China hitting emerging market status and sort of the hockey stick that sort of occurred post China achieving, emerging market status, going from a frontier market to emerging markets is a very big deal, Tom. So I don't want to downplay that at all. And again, particularly at a time when the biggest emerging market in the world with the most market cap, China, has been so poor. Emerging markets investors need a place to go, right? There's just been so much destruction and returns from having China so heavily weighted in the emerging market indexes that, again, if Vietnam were to achieve emerging market status, it's a very big deal.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So look, we've run out of time. And in closing, as many of you have heard me say over and over again, our business is really all about information, insights, and all about relationships. And SSI's ability to deliver a gateway to Vietnam is all about our relationships around the world, our deep roots in Vietnam with people like Ken Hung and Tanwa, but equally as importantly, our global reach with relationships with people like Frank Kelly and Ryan. I thank each of you for being on the panel here. I know that there's a lot of uncertainties, a lot of probably some confusion, but at the end of the day, I really appreciate the insights that you've delivered for our clients, for our partners, and our friends listening in. So thank you for all that. Thank you for your support, and we will be seeing you all again sometime soon. Thanks, speakers. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.